Tune in to the Poker Line with Harry. See you there.
What's up? This is Alan Keating. Check out the Poker Line.
What's up, guys? This session was played at the newest room in Houston, Champions, which is owned by Phil Hellmuth. I actually got to play a meetup game with Phil, Jungle Man, Sean Deeb, and Alan Keating. I had an absolute blast. Unfortunately, I didn't get too much content from that short session. All of these clips will be from my initial 5-10 session played at Champions. We've been regularly running 5-5 and higher stakes at the new room. It's the nicest room and the most secure room in Houston. I definitely recommend you check it out if you're ever in town. Let me know. On to the vlog. Start off my session opening 6-5 of diamonds from middle position to $35. It folds around to the big blind who makes the call. This player is relatively active. I expect them to be 3-betting pretty aggressively and calling the big blind with a slightly wider range. We go to the flop, which is the Queen of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds, 3 of Hearts. Although my opponent might have more trips combos here with their wider range, it also means that they have quite a bit more air, so they're going to be missing this board for the most part. It's a pretty dry board. It's really only going to be pairs, flush draws, and Queen X that are really continuing. I do expect him to continue with some hands that have backdoors, so something like King Jack of Diamonds or Ace 10 with a heart. But overall, I think that this board doesn't connect with my opponent too hard. I have a relatively strong range here. I have a lot of pocket pairs that can value bet. I have a lot of trip combos. And I think my specific combo definitely wants to be betting at a high frequency with the backdoor flush draw and the backdoor straight draw, in addition to having the overcards to the 3. My hand really benefits from the fold equity that it gets, and I'm going to be barreling a lot of turns where I pick up equity. Generally going to be using small sizes. I continue here for a size of $35, and my opponent calls. At this point, I do think that he has one of those hands I said, like a pair or a backdoor draw at the very least. We go to the turn with the pot at $145. The turn is the 4 of spades, giving me the open-ended straight draw. Overall, this card's really not going to interact with my opponent's range for the most part. They could possibly have the flush draw with the 4 and possibly Queen 4 suited, but overall, I don't think this is really interacting with their range too much. It could also bring in a couple of their back doors like the Ace 5, the Ace Deuce. When my opponent checks, I'm generally just going to be barreling here for a very large size because of that, and because my hand has picked up equity, this is a hand that I'm going to barrel at a high frequency. I decide to overbet, betting $225. My opponent thinks for a little bit and he decides to make the call. At this point, my opponent should be slightly stronger. I expect them to have at least a pocket pair with a heart in it, a decent amount of trips, although I do think some of those raise on the flop or the turn, and he's going to have some hands like the Ace 5 and the 4x of hearts, and still continuing with some 3x combos. We go to the river with the pot at $595. The 9 of hearts hits the river. I miss my draw, but I do think with 6 high, I probably do want to be bluffing here. I think overall I'm going to have way more heart combos than my opponent, as they would be raising at some frequency, and I think facing an overbet, we will see some folds from some of their weaker heart draws. I think I also have a stronger range of the nut Queen X hands, and I think all of those can probably continue to bet here. I don't know how often they are overbetting, but overall I'm going to continue my story and use a large sizing. When my opponent checks, I decide to bet $800 and he quickly folds, and we get a pretty decent bluff in to start the session. In this hand, I open up Ace Jack of Spades from early position to $35. It folds to the button, who's the same aggressive regular from the previous hand. He calls, and the small blind also makes the call. The small blind is a younger guy. I would say he's a little bit on the looser side. We go multi-way to the flop with the pot at $115, and we flop the absolute world with the 10 of spades, 9 of diamonds, 8 of spades, giving me the nut flush draw, the open-ended straight draw, and 2 overcards. I think generally my range is going to be checking this board back at a very high frequency. I expect the button to have a lot more of these middling 2-pair combos, the weaker straights that I don't have. And I would expect the younger guy with a slightly wider range to have a lot more of the 2-pair combos. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this board. I do want to be continuing at some frequency, and this is definitely a hand that does want to continue. When it checks to me, I decide to continue here for a bet of $40. Overall, I'm not going to be using too massive of sizes on this board, multi-way. The button makes the call and the small blind folds. I expect the button to very rarely have sets here. I do think that this player being active is going to 3-bet me very frequently with at least pocket 10s and pocket 9s. And I think that they are often going to be raising their 2-pair sets and straights on this flop. So I expect him to often have a hand like ace 10 or 8-7, possibly some flush draws. I think he'll have some overcard with a backdoor straight draw / gut shot, something like the king jack of diamonds, although I think he is raising some of those hands at some frequency. We go to a turn heads up, and the turn is the 7 of diamonds, completing my straight. On this turn card, I'm going to be mixed betting with a lot of my jack X combos. Generally, I want to be betting with my nut straights, so the queen jack, and then betting a lot with my jack X of spades and jack X of diamonds, as I'm going to be often free rolling my opponent's straights. With this double flush draw board, I do expect my opponents to still continue with a lot of their 2-pair combos. If he does have a set here, if he had something like pocket 7s or pocket 8s, I expect him to continue. And I also think that my opponent's going to continue some of their flush draws that still have a straight draw, as well as their lower straight draw. So I think there's still a lot of value to be made from my hand. I continue here with a pretty large size, betting 150 into 195. My opponent thinks for a while, and he makes the call. The river is the 8 of hearts, not my favorite river in the deck, although it does reduce the amount of pocket 8s and 8-7 that my opponent does have. That is 2-pair. I do expect a lot of their 2-pair and sets to previously raise, but overall I think even if I'm still ahead, it's a lot harder for me to gain value here. I'm going to hope to get called by essentially something like ace 10 that hero calls, or something like 7-6, 6-5 that has the lower end of the straight. Either way, I think that my hand is still a pretty strong candidate to value bet, and I do continue here with probably slightly too large of a size in hindsight, but I bet $360. My opponent thinks for a little while, and ultimately they do make the fold, but we pick up this nice pot. In this hand, we see an early position limp, and I decide to open up Jack 9 of hearts to $40, also from early position. It folds around to the small blind, who is a very aggressive younger pro. He 3-bets to $200. I think this player is very active, especially when they're 3-betting, and I expect them to be 3-betting a pretty wide range here. The limper folds, and I think I have an interesting decision here. Generally, I think this hand is probably going to be a fold. I'm opening a pretty strong range here from early position. I think that Jack 9 suited is an okay candidate to continue with, though. I'm going to be mostly shedding my offsuit combos, and being in position here, I think that it's reasonable to continue. So I make the call. We go to the flop with the pot at $420. The flop is the Jack 9-5, all spades. Overall, this is going to be a board that favors me as the 3-bet caller. I'm going to have a much higher concentration of flush draws. As I said, I'm shedding a lot of those offsuit hands pre-flop. I also have a higher concentration of pocket 9s and pocket 5s here. My opponent checks, which I do think he is going to do at a very high frequency due to the range advantage that I have on this board. And I think generally, because I also have the nut advantage with the flushes and more sets, I want to be using large sizes here. Jack 9 is clearly a value hand on this board, so I'm going to bet large here. I think overall I am going to be mixing in a lot more small sizes on the monotone boards, just a little bit less so when I'm in this specific scenario. I float bet for $250, and he makes the call. When he makes the call here, I expect him to be trapping with a lot of his stronger pocket pairs, even with a spade, something like aces or kings. I think he does have a small frequency of sets here, although I think both of those style of hands are betting very frequently on the flop. I think he's going to have a lot of offsuit cards like the ace king with a spade. He's going to have a lot of pocket pairs here, often continuing with a spade in his hand, so something like pocket 10s with a spade. I think he should be folding something like pocket 8s if he decided to 3-bet that pre-flop, as well as a lot of his gut shots and stuff. So I do think that he has a pretty strong range when he continues here facing my float bet. We go to the turn with the pot at $920. The turn is the 2 of spades, not the card I'm looking to see. Obviously, my specific hand is quite a bit diminished as I'm sitting here with 2-pair on a 4-flush board, but overall this board is going to be very favorable for my opponent. He has a lot more of the offsuit combos that contain the stronger spades, hands like aces, kings, queens with a single spade, as well as ace king, ace queen with a single spade that I really don't have at a very high frequency in my range. He's also ahead of me with a lot of those weaker pocket pairs that decided to continue. I'm still beating some of his hands like pocket aces, pocket tens that decided to continue. So I think when he checks, I generally do want to check back here and try to just pot control against those hands. The river is a pretty interesting card. The river is the 2 of clubs, and my opponent decides to check again. At this point, I think that my hand's often losing against a lot of his medium pocket pairs with the spade and possibly some overcards with the spade. I've also been counterfeited against his hands like aces, kings, and queens, which now have a better 2 pair. I think with my specific hand blocking pocket jacks and pocket nines and also having a higher frequency of sets in my entire range, I think this is a pretty reasonable hand to turn into a bluff. I think if I'm going to bluff with this hand, I want to use pretty massive sizes representing essentially nut flushes that checked on the turn and all of my full houses. I bet $1,100 into the $900 pot. My opponent tanks for a while and ultimately does fold, and we get a pretty creative bluff through here. In this hand, there's an under the gun limp. I open up pocket queens in the +1 position to $40. The player directly to my left decides to cold 3-bet to $125. This player is a pretty strong reg. I expect them to be relatively balanced, but I do think that they are probably slightly stronger in this specific configuration where I'm opening under the gun. It folds around to the under the gun player and he decides to cold call the 3-bet, which is a little bit surprising. I expect him to mostly have pocket pairs here, some stronger suited connectors and broadways. Thought about just flatting the 3-bet, but I think this is a hand that probably doesn't want to go multi-way, and obviously I'm near the top of my range as well in terms of value, so I decide to 4-bet it to $550. The reg decides to then 5-bet it to $1,300. Generally, I think that 5-bets are going to be extremely strong. I don't think that people are very balanced in their 5-bets in general. This is screaming something like aces and kings. I'm not sure if this player would really do this with queens or ace king at any frequency, and his 5-bet is pretty large. So I actually think that I have a pretty comfortable fold here, and I do make that fold. After the fact, I'm pretty sure that this player did have aces, so I think that my fold ended up being correct. In this hand, we have a $20 straddle. The younger pro opens it to $60 in the cutoff. It folds around to me in the big blind, and I look down at ace of hearts, queen of hearts. This is going to be a very high frequency 3-bet for me, especially versus an opponent that I think is opening slightly wider from later positions. I 3-bet to $260. He thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. We go to the flop, which is the ace of diamonds, king of diamonds, 10 of clubs. Overall, this is going to be a pretty massive range advantage for the 3-better. I have a lot more of the stronger hands like sets, aces, kings, tens, and the stronger 2-pair combos like ace, king that my opponent doesn't have. I think I also have slightly more straights here, as I would have some queen jack off combos, and my opponent is mostly going to be folding those pre-flop. My opponent does have a lot of medium strength hands here though. He has a lot of ace-x combos, he has a lot of Broadway combos that have a pair and a straight draw or a pair and a flush draw. Overall, I'm just going to be using small sizes on this board. I think that my opponent's decisions are going to be relatively binary. A lot of their weaker pocket pairs are going to be folding, as well as their suited connectors, and they'll be continuing with a lot of their single pair hands and flush draws. My pair here is a pretty clear value bet with top pair, top kicker, and I continue for $175. My opponent thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. We go to the turn with the pot at $900. The turn is the 4 of spades. This is a card that really shouldn't interact with my opponent's range unless he has something like ace 4 suited specifically, which we are also blocking, so there's only one combo. Generally on these innocuous turn cards that don't hit your opponent's range, you want to be sizing up. I think I still have a pretty clear value bet here. My opponent has a lot of weaker ace-x combos. They also have a lot of the Broadway pairs that are going to continue, like king-queen, queen-10, jack-10 that are a straight draw and a pair, as well as some 10x combos that are flush draws. I continue here for $600. My opponent thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. We go to the river with the pot at $2,100, and the river is the 4 of diamonds. Not the river card I really wanted to see. My opponent has quite a few more flushes than I do. They have a lot of the weaker suited connected flush draws as well as the 10x combos. In 3-bet pots, I'm primarily going to have ace and king high flush draws, which isn't possible on this specific board. And although I think that my opponent is folding some of those weaker suited connected flush draws on the turn, I do expect them to continue on the turn with all of their queen x, jack x, and 10x flush draws. The other problem with this river card is my pretty strong value hand has now been diminished quite a bit. I'm now chopping with all ace x combos. So I think at this point, I probably just want to be playing my hand as a check. I'm blocking some of my opponent's value with the queen jack combos, and this will allow him to decide to bluff with some of his weaker pocket pairs that he possibly continued on the turn, as well as some of his weaker king x. I think given that information, I probably want to be playing my hand as a bluff catcher and just checking and calling most of my opponent's reasonable sized bets. I do block the straight, which I think that he should be value betting on the river, and I do block some of his 2-pair combos that should also be going for value. I think this also allows my opponent, who is generally on the aggressive side, to decide to turn any of his 10x combos into a bluff. I don't think he has too many pocket pairs under the 10x, but if he does, then I expect those to bluff, and possibly some of his weaker king x combos, although I expect most of his ace x and king x combos to check back on the river. We check, and our opponent quickly checks behind. We show ace queen, and he says we're good, and we scoop this $2,100 pot. Similar to a previous hand, we see a limp, and this time I open up pocket queens to $50 from the hijack, and I swear I'm going through deja vu as the reg directly to my left decides to 3-bet to $175. Although this time the hand plays out quite a bit differently as the player in the small blind decides to 4-bet to $500 off of a shorter stack. This player has been incredibly tight the entire session, and they've put in about 2/3 of their stack on this 4-bet. And I think at this point I have a pretty simple fold again. I do not think that this person is cold 4-betting wide at all. I don't think that they probably have ace king or queens. I think it's very likely that we're up against kings or aces for a second time today. It gets back to me, and I have a pretty trivial fold. And for the second time tonight, I have folded pocket queens pre-flop. Something that I have not really done for a very long time. I've done twice. The reg quickly folds, and he said he was just messing around that time, and the small blind pulls in this pot. In this hand, we have a $20 straddle and an early position limp. I open up pocket fours to $75 from the low jack. The straddler calls and the initial limper calls, and we go 3 ways to a flop with the pot at $250. The flop is the 5 of clubs, 3 of spades, 8 of spades. Generally, this is going to be a board that I'm betting at a very low frequency. I think that this board texture heavily favors the pre-flop callers as they have more of the suited connected hands that make 2-pair combos, as well as they have more of the straight draws and some of the flush draws. While I have a lot more of the broadways that have completely missed this board in my range, I also think that both of them are more likely to have a higher concentration of sets here. I think that my specific hand definitely wants to be betting here at some frequency. In the moment, I thought I had the 4 of spades, so I did think that I had 2 backdoor draws, but in general, I think 4s is probably reasonable to bet here. I deny a lot of equity from overcards, while also gaining value from their straight draws, their flush draws, and their 3x combos. When it checks to me, I do decide to continue here for a bet of $75. Never really using large sizes here, multi-way. Unfortunately, both players decide to make the call. At this point, I expect them to have a straight draw, a flush draw, or a pair. I don't expect too many overcards to be calling, multi-way especially. We go to the turn, which is the 7 of spades. Generally, I should be shutting down on this card, but like I said, I did think that I had the 4 of spades, so I did think that I was blocking some of my opponent's continues here, as well as essentially having a weaker draw. I think that if I continue here, it is very hard for my opponents to continue though, as a lot of their single pair combos do have to fold without additional equity. I do expect a lot of the pair plus straight draw or pair plus flush draw to be continuing, as well as obviously flushes and straights. I decide to go large here and bet $260, and the straddler decides to call. At this point, I would have expected a lot of his sets in 2 pairs from the flop to be raising, so I think at best he probably has a straight here or a 2-pair combo. When he makes the call here, I expect him to at best have a 2-pair or a straight combo here for the most part. I do think it's possible for him to have some flushes, but I think a lot of his stronger flush draws would have been raising on the flop or be raising on the turn. And because I think a lot of his range consists of a lot of these pair plus straight draws, pair plus flush draws, or two pair combos, I think that I'm able to blow him off of his hand on the river pretty frequently. We go to the river, which is the 9 of clubs. He checks and I decide to go for an overbet. I think it's pretty hard for him to continue here with a lot of his two pair combos, especially with a 4-liner out there. Although I do think that he has some 6x combos like 8-6, 7-6, 6-5. I think that a lot of his range does consist of single pair combos or possibly two pair combos, and I think it's really hard to call a triple barrel here with those combos. And I think that I tell a reasonable story of a flush when I triple barrel here pretty large versus two opponents. I do have a lot of these strong flushes as my value region here. He tanks for quite a while, and unfortunately he does decide to put in the call. Fortunately for us, he thought we were bluffing, which we were, but he decided to hero call us with pocket 2s, and our pocket 4s somehow become a value bet on the river, and we get paid off by our overbet, and we win this $2,600 pot. In this hand, we have a cutoff open by an aggressive player to $30, and I look down at the best hand in poker, pocket aces in the big blind. I decide to make the pot a little bit larger and 3-bet it to 135. He thinks for a little bit and makes the call. We go to the flop, which is the Queen of Hearts, 5 of Hearts, Jack of Clubs. Pocket aces here, especially with the heart, can definitely be mixing in a lot of check, but I think generally this is going to be a board that is pretty advantageous for me as the pre-flop raiser. I still have a lot of the over pairs, some two pair combos, as well as pocket queens and pocket jacks. Generally just going to be using small sizes here, and I continuation bet for $100. He quickly calls, and we go to the turn, which is the 3 of Hearts. The third flush card is generally going to be better for my opponent, but I definitely still want to be barreling here at some frequency. Having the backup plan of the nut flush draw is a pretty good reason to bet here. I think that my opponent would have continued flop with a lot of pocket pairs that contain a heart that are going to have to continue on the turn here, as well as any Jack of Hearts combos. He's also going to have hands like Ace Queen, King Queen that are probably going to be calling one more bet. And if somehow I'm behind, I have additional equity here with my overpair. I decide to go relatively large here and barrel for 275. He thinks for a little bit and he elects to make the call. And we go to the river card, which is the 2 of Hearts, giving me the nut flush. Generally, this is going to be a card that is very favorable for the pre-flop 3-better, as I'm going to have a lot of the big pocket pairs like aces and kings, as well as ace king, ace queen with the single heart. So I have a lot more nut flushes than my opponent. In this specific scenario, I do think it is a little difficult for my opponent to have a very strong flush, as a lot of their stronger flushes would have to be in the Broadway region. The Queen of Hearts is already out there, and I have the Ace of Hearts in my hand, and I don't think it's too likely that my opponent would have continued to a 3-bet with a lot of the offsuit combos. There's probably a little bit of Ace King in there and some King Queen, but I wouldn't expect to see any weaker Broadways. And I think that a lot of his made flushes would have been raising on the turn. So I think most of the flushes that my opponent gets here on the river with are going to be pocket pairs that contain a single heart or something like Ace Jack with the Jack of Hearts. Overall, I think that I want to be using pretty large sizes here. I decided to size down because of this specific scenario and hope to get called a little bit more often by those medium flushes and possibly something like Queen Jack or a set of 5s. I bet $850, which is still a very sizable bet, but I think I would be overbetting here at some frequency, so it's not the largest size I would be using. He tanks for a little bit and he says he probably should raise, but he just makes the call, and he shows the Ace King with the King of Hearts. So I definitely pulled in a very massive pot here, but I do think that my opponent lost the minimum. I think that he's often going to be 4-betting pre-flop, and I think that he's often going to be raising the flop, turn, or river. I think a lot more money could have gone in here, so I think overall my opponent played this pretty well and he lost the minimum. In the final notable hand of the night, we see a hijack open to $25. The cutoff decides to flat, and I look down at Ace of Spades, 5 of Spades in the button. For those that don't know, Ace 5 is one of my favorite hands to use as a 3-bet bluff, and I decide to go for it here, and I bump it up to $110. The hijack and the cutoff both make the call, and we go 3 ways to a $400 flop, which is the 8 of Spades, 8 of Clubs, Jack of Spades, giving me the nut flush draw. The hijack checks, and surprisingly, the cutoff player decides to donk for half pot, betting $200 into both of us. I think that my hand can play as either a raise or a call. I don't expect to get too many folds from a raise here. I expect a donk bet to primarily be Jack X combos here, but he definitely could be donk betting with an 8X combo. I think if he's donk betting with a draw, it's going to be a stronger flush draw or a hand like 10-9. I don't really expect either of those to be folding. So in this specific scenario, when I'm in position, I decide to make the call this time. And we go heads up to the turn, which is the 10 of spades, giving me the nut flush. And I'm ecstatic when the cutoff player decides to continue barreling here for a large size, and they continue for $500. At this point, I think that I probably do want to raise. My opponent often has a pretty strong made hand here. I think he has, at the very least, a Jack X combo. I'd be surprised to see too many Jack X combos barrel here on the turn though. So I think that he often has possibly a hand like Jack 10, but more likely trips or a weaker flush. And I think against that range of hands, I generally just want to be raising. I decide to raise it to $1,300 with the plan to get it in on the river. He thinks for a little bit and he decides to make the call. And we go to the river with a $3,400 pot, and the river is the ace of clubs, which really doesn't change too much. My opponent could have specifically ace-8 suited. I wouldn't expect them to have too many full houses here though, as I would have expected them to be raising pre-flop or putting in more action post-flop with pocket jacks or pocket tens. I don't think jacks or tens make too much sense to donk bet either. My opponent quickly moves all in for 1770, and I don't think I have too much of a decision here. If my opponent has me beat, they have me beat, but I have the nut flush and I make the call quickly. Unfortunately for my opponent, he just got into a cooler as he turned the second nut flush versus my nut flush draw, and we win this $6,900 pot to end the session. An absolute wild session. I definitely ran very well in a couple spots, but I also folded queens twice pre-flop, I think correctly. I don't remember the last time that I folded queens once, much less twice in the session, so that was kind of crazy. Overall, I did very well and I made about $8.5K this session, so off to a very good start in the new room. So hopefully the trend continues.